Hey, what's going on, guys? We got a very special guest today. We have Darryl Stickel. Darryl is one of the world's leading experts on trust. Darryl Stickel is an executive coach with over 20 years experience focused on trust. His PhD, Building Trust in Hostile Environments, from Duke University established his unique and practical approach to building trust. Darryl, how are we doing today?
Better now that I'm hanging out with you, Jordan.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on the Clockedin podcast. So, Darryl, where does your journey begin?
That's a good question because it's very formative, right? Our life makes sense in retrospect. And so I was born and raised in a small town in northern British Columbia. And it was isolated and weathers were pretty toxic and hostile. And so, you're part of a small community, you have to pull together. And so I developed a sense of empathy and this belief that the strong should help the weak, and that if you could help people, you should. And I had a fairly traumatic childhood / early adulthood, lots of concussions and challenges, but sometimes a hard road's a good teacher. It teaches you what it's like to struggle, to be vulnerable, to be helpless or hopeless. And so my experiences pushed me to develop a pretty deep sense of empathy with folks. And I toyed with the idea of becoming a clinical psychologist. And I started working with families, troubled teens, families in crisis, working on crisis lines, those kinds of things, to hone some of those skills. And it seemed like there was something about me that made people comfortable, that allowed them to open up to me in a way that they didn't to most folks. And so I tried to understand what that was. And, partway through, I chose to move away from clinical psychology, trying to find the right path forward. I went into public administration, worked in native land claims. And they would ask me these deep philosophical questions like, what is self-government? Or what will the province look like after claims are settled? The last question they asked me was, how do we convince a group of people we've shafted for over 100 years they should trust us? And that seemed like a really good question. I thought to myself, we're in government. Maybe it would help if we were trustworthy. That didn't get nearly the positive response one would hope for. And so I left and went to Duke and wrote my doctoral thesis on building trust in hostile environments. And then I ended up working for McKinsey Company, a big management consulting firm. And they identified me as somebody with really good client hands. They said, wow, this guy gets clients to open up like most others don't. So let's send him to the worst places possible. And, so I'm finding myself, yeah.
I think it's, I just want to butt in really quick, but I think it's so cool how you utilized, and your team kind of utilizes questions to think about things. Because when usually we think about it as individuals having a conversation, it will go, oh, Darryl, how's your day going? Good. How was yours? And it will kind of be that back and forth. But when you think about, hey, this question has been pondering me right now, how does it make you feel? How do you think about it? Right. It's a very unique way to have a conversation. And I think it can be very beneficial, just because I like bringing this stuff because the audience is there and listens and they're like, how does this relate to me? The different questions you can be asking your family can really change.
Yeah, that's a really powerful insight, actually, Jordan, because a big part of what I do is I think of it as the Socratic methods. Socrates talked about, questioning and those kinds of things. And really it's powerful to ask people questions and to get a sense of what matters to them, what the story is that they're using to interpret the world. And so actually a good question that occurs to me right now, or at least I think it's a good question, is what would be powerful for your listeners? How could I be the best guest possible for you?
That's incredible. I appreciate how you're so aware and so astute. And I definitely think it would be us going through your story and then us diving into some of your trust methods and how we can really increase this for a lot of individuals. And like Darryl was saying, watch next time you have a conversation with someone. Is it you blabbering out to them, telling them everything going on in your life? Or do you start it with, so tell me something fun that's going on with you. Tell me something that's unique that happened to you this week. Tell me something you're grateful for. And you get a
Right.
completely different conversation because you ask different questions. Most of the time, we always ask the same questions, and that's why we get the same results.
Right. And we don't give the sense that we're actually listening. Right. That question, how you doing? And if somebody said absolutely terrible, oh yeah, good to hear. Um, you know, and so we don't have that sense that people really mean it when they're asking those questions. And Jordan and I, your listeners aren't aware of this, but Jordan and I have had 2 conversations now that have gone extensive lengths because we just engage so well together and have such a good time connecting. Um, and part of that is this real interest in what's going on with the other person and a real desire to hear and listen to what's going on for them. And what you've triggered to is the central piece for me is around including other people in the conversation. When we're trying to build trust, we try to be intentional about what our objectives are, what our intent is, what our goals are, so that the other person isn't left guessing. And a lot of this involves connecting with that other person and including them in the conversation to understand what good looks like for them, what a good outcome would look like for them. And so for me, that was a big part of the work I did at McKinsey. I just connected with clients. I was put in a place where I was sent to a client site where there'd been a strike a couple of years previously, and they had fired everyone to get rid of the union. They then hired them all back because it was the middle of nowhere, right? And so there's a lot of animosity. The plant manager was killed during the strike. Shots were fired. And I got sent in there to try to figure out how to cut costs. And it's not a great place to be, but after 6 weeks, we have a progress review, and the head of the new union stands up and says, we understand that costs are a problem. Labor's a part of that. We're committed to doing whatever we have to do to make this work. And the VP for North America and the plant manager and the McKinsey partner all just looked at me and said, what did you do? And I said, I just talked to him. I connected with him. I said, look, there's a real struggle here, because if this doesn't get sorted, the plant's going to close. And then everyone's out of a job. And, they believed me because it was true. And so figuring out how to connect with folks and then teaching other people how to do that has been my life's work.
Oh, that's incredible. And I think one of the biggest things that you mentioned right there is that how often do you think that the regular worker who's working at the plant truly got asked, what's your opinion? Or
Right.
what do you think good is here? The amount of workers that are just do your job, keep your mouth shut and move on.
Yeah.
Then they go home and their wives are like, we don't want to talk to you. They watch TV and they just quiet down.
Yeah.
Instead of going like that true interest and that true conversation of what happened? Like, what do you see in this? How can this be a good outcome? How can we make a good outcome? And I love that, because you'll see a lot of times when people have conversations, they tend to guess where
Right.
they'll go, like you just told me you went to Duke, and the example would be, oh, you went to Syracuse, right? And then you'd be like, no, it was Duke. And now the conversation's just kind of ruined because I butted in and tried to guess instead of saying, what college did you get a scholarship to?
Right. Yeah. And so that Socratic approach where you're sort of interested, asking questions, follow-up questions, showing an interest in the other person. And one of the examples I give, because I think we all have the ability to build trust, but some are better than others, and those who aren't very good have a lever that they pull. Usually it's the ability lever. I've got this much experience, these kinds of credentials, this kind of background. Those who are better have multiple levers. And those who are really good have multiple levers and they know when to pull which one. And so three of the levers come from us as individuals, and they're the ones that are most popularly talked about in the literature. It's benevolence, integrity, and ability. Benevolence is the belief you've got my best interest at heart. Integrity is, do my actions actually align with the values that I express? And do I follow through on the promises that I make? And then abilities, do I have the confidence to do what I say I'm going to do? And so if there's a gap in benevolence and I'm pulling the ability lever, I miss. And so what I try to do is show people the 10 levers and then talk them through how to pull each one. And so as an example, let's talk about benevolence. A lot of times we have people's best interest at heart, but it doesn't land that way. When I work with families, I'll talk to the parents and I'll say, how many of you have your kids' best interest at heart? And all the hands will go up. And then when I say, how many of your kids would say that? It's about a third. And it's somewhat hesitant. And so if it's not obvious in that situation, how does a leader get it to come across? Or how does a friend get it to come across? Or how does a coworker get it to come across that they actually have someone else's best interest at heart? And so what I do is I give people a template for those first conversations. I'll say, here's the conversation you're going to have. I heard this guy, Darryl, he was on Clockedin. He was talking with Jordan, and he was talking about benevolence, this belief that you've got someone else's best interest at heart. And I think I do that. I think I act, in a way that's benevolent, but it doesn't always seem to land that way. Have you ever experienced that? And the other person's going to go, oh yeah, because we've all run into that at one point or another, where thought we were doing something to help somebody and it turned out it didn't, or they didn't think it did. And I said, and then you're going to say, well, have you ever had someone act in your best interest? Have you ever felt like someone really had your back? What did that look like? What did they do? And now you're starting to get hints and you're starting to prime the conversation. They're starting to think about a time when somebody actually did look out for them. And then you narrow the funnel a little further and you go, what would it look like if I acted in your best interest? What would benevolence look like from me? What does success look like from you? And how do I help you get there? And now we can be transparent as we move along. Because you remember when I asked you what would a good outcome look like for your listeners and for you? Well, you said you wanted people to be engaged and you wanted them to pick up something that they could take away with them. I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially, part of what we talked about. And now they can take that template and they can use it in any conversation they decide to have. And so that was me trying to be benevolent, is trying to share some of the content that I use with my students for you and your listeners to actually take away and apply tomorrow.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that, because that is exactly what we talked about. And one of the best things. So if you guys didn't catch that, I would definitely pause the podcast, rewind, and go through that activity. Because the thing is, in our life, we're constantly trying to guess. We don't know the answers. And honestly, these people might not even, the people you're asking this question to might not know the answer either.
Right.
But let them work through it. Because if they don't know what they want, how can you guessing knowing what they want? And everyone claims to know each other so well. I don't know if I believe that, because you need to have these deep conversations.
Right. So I had a conversation with one of my students, and what I do when I'm working on these things is I sit down with people and I say, pick a relationship. We're going to actually focus on a relationship that you're going to try to strengthen. And one of my students, I said, tell me a relationship that you want to think about, one that matters to you. And he said, my girlfriend. I said, all right. So what matters most to your girlfriend? And he said, I think her family does. I said, all right. So tonight, when you go home, you're going to have a conversation with your girlfriend. And you're going to say, I was with Darryl today. I was taking this class on trust. He told me to think about a relationship that really mattered to me. And I thought about you. Step one, we're showing the other person that we're thinking about them and that the relationship matters to us. So then you're going to say, he asked me what mattered most to you. And I said, family. Is that right? Now you're inviting her into the conversation. She has the opportunity to agree or disagree. But when she says, yeah, my family really matters to me, you're going to say, I thought that was true. And so I suspect that it really matters to you that I get along well with your family. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start spending more time with them. I'm going to try to build a stronger relationship with your family because it matters so much to you. And the next day I see him again, because it's a 2-day workshop. And he gives me this huge grin and he says, my girlfriend says I'm allowed to talk to you whenever I want. What's next? And so that's one lever. And that's talking through how we actually go about pulling it. We can do the same thing when we talk about integrity, because you've observed a couple of times, we interpret the world through stories. We're guessing a lot of times. And if we don't create the story together, then there's a real chance for us to miss. But if we start including that other person in the conversation, we get so much credit for the effort that we're making. And what students come back to me and say often is, it felt awkward. It felt like I was exercising a new muscle or something. It seems so obvious, but then I started having the conversation and I felt, oh, this feels a little strange. It feels a little odd. But the response was overwhelmingly positive. Because once you tell someone, hey, I want to build a stronger relationship, here's the approach I'm taking, you're making yourself a little bit vulnerable to them. And they have the instinct to want to respond. And they're going to give you the benefit of the doubt. So you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be trying and be clear in your intent. And it's an exercise we can all get better at. We can all practice. We can all get more skilled at. And that's what I tried to do in the book. I'm trying to scale this, right? Because there's a lot of people talking about trust, but they're not talking about what we can actually do about it, how we can actually build it. And that's what I've done for the last 20 years, is try to help people build stronger relationships.
Yeah. And Darryl, after we met twice, as you mentioned. It is very interesting how actionable Darryl's steps are. He always provides an immense amount of value because you can take action in that moment right now to change that conversation and just be observant, just be open to the idea of how these conversations occur. Because this is one of my favorite things about the podcast is that I can record this and it's saved forever and people can listen and I can relearn these lessons as well.
Right.
So Darryl, so you're at McKinsey and
Yeah.
you head into what ends up occurring? What are the steps?
So I ended up being in a car accident, ended up with post-concussion syndrome. Car I was in rear-ended another vehicle. And I'd had a series of concussions before that. This was just the one, it was the straw that broke the camel's back. And so, struggle with fatigue and memory problems and concentration, and I just couldn't work at McKinsey anymore. So I end up starting my own little company called Trust Unlimited. One of my former colleagues comes to me and he says, hey, look, I'm head of strategy for a mutual fund company now. Just come talk to us. And so I find myself standing in front of 400 people saying, you guys are talking about sustainable competitive advantage. That means you do something better than your competitors that they can't copy. And you don't do anything I can't copy. I buy one share of every fund you have. Now I know how they're all built. I don't have to pay the fund advisor. I sell what you sell at a discount. And I said, the only thing you can do is build deep long-term relationships with your customers. And they said, that's it. That's our strategy. And so this was my first application of the concepts, because they asked me to build a 2-day workshop and I trained everybody. And so after 18 months of me working with them, coaching them, consulting, doing all these training, they hired a professional survey firm, found out their trust was the primary driver of the sales decision, that they were dramatically more trusted than any of their competitors. And they started generating 75 cents of every new dollar that came into the industry for the next 2 years.
Wow.
And so they went from being middle of the road to dominant. And they were part of a global financial services firm. And that firm started sending teams from all over the world, Europe, Asia, everywhere, to figure out what these guys were doing. because they weren't just dominating Canada, they were dominating the world. And, from that experience, I came to realize, okay, it's not perfect, but it works. And that started a 20-year journey where I worked with the Canadian military trying to help them figure out how to build trust with the locals in Afghanistan. I've worked with nonprofits, I've worked with families, I've worked with private sector, public sector, government, just a huge range of organizations and individuals. And this whole time I'm learning, because, it just, there's so much you learn from applying this thing and seeing different situations and experiencing different things. And part of that journey is not just learning, but also learning how to communicate it to other people in a way that makes sense. And
yeah, Darryl, that's what I really want to applaud you on, is that when you start sharing the story, people need to realize that he said yes without an answer. Like, he didn't have the solution before he said yes. He said yes, and then they wanted more, and it was more yeses. And that's the quote unquote school of hard knocks, or learning on the job, or whatever it is. If you can present value to people, people will see the value. And Darryl's selling something that I don't think anyone thinks about selling. It's selling trust. It's helping people get better at trust. Like, if you have a product, if you have any type of service, it's so much more tangible. Selling trust is a very difficult sale, and you're doing it at the largest levels.
Absolutely. And one of the challenges is that 95% of people believe they're more trustworthy than average, right? Aside from being statistically impossible, it creates problems, because it means that when we do run into trust problems, we think it's somebody else's fault. And so we're not working on it ourselves. We're not trying to hone our own skills and get better at communicating. And really what I'm trying to do is help people close the gap between how much they should be trusted and how much they actually are. And it's a more valuable skill than it's ever been, because it's so scarce right now.
Yeah.
And like, my sons are 21 and 18, and they mean more to me than anything. And they've been stuck with me their whole lives, but they hear me talk about this, and they've been raised with me using it and being really transparent about it. And I have this incredibly positive relationship with them. But it's also created an environment where it future-proofs them, because they're able to build relationships even in really difficult settings. And so it creates an environment where they are going to be able to thrive no matter what. And, leaders are struggling right now because things are moving so fast. Trust is a combination of uncertainty and vulnerability. It's, uncertainty times vulnerability gives us a level of perceived risk. And we each have a threshold of risk that we're comfortable with. And so if we go beyond that threshold, we don't trust. If we're beneath it, then we do. Well, what that means is that in early relationships, uncertainty is high, and we can only tolerate a small range of vulnerability to still stay below that risk threshold. But as that relationship deepens, the level of uncertainty starts to go down, which means the range of vulnerability we can tolerate starts to grow. And if we think about what's going on in the world right now, our vulnerability isn't going down, but boy, is uncertainty ever bouncing all over the place. We see pandemics where rules are different in different regions, in different organizations, all over the place. That creates a tremendous amount of uncertainty. And the medical community comes out with some recommendations, and then their understanding of the virus changes and the recommendations change. And people are like, well, that's not what you told me 6 weeks ago. Well, that's because that's not what we knew 6 weeks ago. But now there starts to become doubt. And let's add to that the pace of technological change and the change in norms and values. So uncertainty is bouncing all over the place, which makes us incredibly uncomfortable. And it means we need to be far more intentional than we've ever been about building trust.
I completely agree with that. And for the example you gave with the example you were just describing, with it was vulnerability and uncertainty, the thing that came to my mind, just because I think this might be valuable for everyone listening, was when you think about the fact of dating someone for the first time, like going on a first date, because the vulnerability the uncertainty is very high. The vulnerability, they can't handle that much. That's why it's like, hey, let's get pizza, or let's go to the movies, or let's do this. As they
Right.
start to become more comfortable, you go, oh, this weekend, do you want to go on a trip? Because now
Right.
you're building that they're willing to be more vulnerable, and they're more accepting of these opportunities and these things. But if you went to someone on the first date being like, hey, like we should go on like a 2 month trip, they'd be
Right.
like, that is way too much vulnerability. You're
Way too
creeping me
soon.
out. Yeah,
Yeah.
I gotta go. I gotta go.
Yeah. Yeah. Or if the date, you get early on in the date and you're kind of feeling like this isn't working for me, start asking about children. Um, it'll end quickly. And so,
Yeah.
one of the things that I recommend is that we take small steps of vulnerability early on, right? We make ourselves just a little bit vulnerable by revealing a bit of information about ourselves, or sharing something, or whatever that looks like, but just small bits, because it initiates a norm of reciprocity. It makes us want to respond in kind, do the same thing. If that first offer is so big, it scares the other person off, because they're basically saying, I'm not willing to respond at that level yet.
And Darryl, would you agree or disagree that this is a very similar concept to selling?
Absolutely. And if we think about, how do we take steps to reduce people's uncertainty, how do we minimize their vulnerability early on in a relationship? One of the examples I like to use is an ice cream parlor, where they give out free little tasters, right? And so you go in and you're like, well, let me just try a little bit of that rum and raisin. And then you realize, I don't like rum and I don't like raisin. Like, thank God I didn't buy a whole bowl, right? Because that would have been a higher level of vulnerability. We see this with cashback offers, with insurance claims, with contracts that we sign. All of these are managing levels of uncertainty and vulnerability. And when we're trying to sell, we're trying to convince people to make themselves a bit vulnerable. Well, we need to figure out ways to reduce their uncertainty to make them comfortable with that. And a lot of times what I did, when I was working with the mutual fund company, I basically told them to change the approach that they took, because their focus was on selling product. And they were trying to go from 10% of someone's book, because they sold to financial advisors. So they're trying to go from 10% of that person's book to 11% or 12%. I said, that's the wrong mindset. What you want to be doing is taking that person and doubling their book, because 10% of twice as much is twice as much. And so your focus should be on helping your customers be successful. And they said, well, how do we sell that? Like, how do we profit from that? I said, don't worry about it. They'll start coming to you and asking to buy more of your product, because they trust you. And that's exactly what happened. They changed their mindset of, I need to get an incremental improvement, to, I need to help this person dramatically increase their business, because it helps me. And as they became trusted, those people started to turn to them and say, look, the most I can have of one product line is 20%. I'm going to max that out, but I want you to still be part of my business. And so they created partnerships.
And
And yeah.
I was gonna say that this is super important, that the longer you can stay in that game with someone, that is why it's very hard to go off the cuff. That's why people struggle with cold calling. And when you cold call someone, you're going to look to set a meeting, not to do
Right.
the deal. Because when you do the deal on the cold call, they're like, I don't know who you are. This doesn't work.
Right.
That is why people just try to set meetings with that. Now, yeah.
Yeah. And one of the big things about sales is people want referrals. Well, it's one thing if I buy something from you and make a mistake, and I don't tell anyone about it because I feel like an idiot. It's an entirely different thing if I convince all my friends to buy something from you and it turns out to be bad. And so the vulnerability of me purchasing your services or your product is not as high as me recommending it to my friends and associates. because that's putting my relationships and my reputation at risk. And so you're right. The longer we can stay in sync with our clients, with our customers, the more we can have a focus on them having a successful experience, the more likely they are to bring other people to the table.
Yeah,
And
yeah. And the less it becomes a transactional, you pay me to do this.
right,
It's more like, Jim, like, you're my friend. Like, of course I'll help you out. What do you need?
right. And then they're willing to say, hey, you should talk to Jim, you know, or you should talk to Jordan. He was really helpful. And one of the things I convinced the sales guys to do at this mutual fund company was to stop just offering their products, to say, hey, when you segment your customers, they should have this kind of profile of investments. And so there's 8 buckets in that profile. And here's a product for each of those buckets, or a list of 5 products for each of those buckets. And in each of those, I'm going to tell you which ones I think are best. And they're not always going to be mine. And so actually having the customer's best interest at heart goes a long way. And it's the same thing if we're looking for a job. Hiring is a trust decision. And so if your listeners are out there searching for a job or a better job or looking for a promotion, that's a trust decision for the organization and for them. And so, when a company's deciding to hire someone, they make themselves vulnerable by allowing them access to their people and their assets and their resources. And they spend time and energy and money on attracting and training and developing that person. They want that investment to pay off. Well, how do we reduce their uncertainty about that? Part of it is, we do a great job of pulling the ability lever. I've got these kinds of credentials, this background, these references. But sometimes we can actually pull the integrity lever. Here's how this organization aligns with my values. This is why I would be passionate to work here. Here's past places that I've worked that have had similar alignment. Or benevolence. What are some of the challenges that this organization faces? How could I be helpful in solving that? What would the overlap be between my role if I got this job and your role? What would a good colleague look like? Because when we hire someone, we're not just hiring a set of skills, we're hiring an individual who we're going to have to interact with. And so to the extent that we can show them that we actually have care and concern about being a good teammate, about helping them succeed, about helping the group succeed, it makes that decision easier for them.
Yeah. I mean, that one question that you just brought up where you're the interviewee. The interviewer is asking you their work at the company. You're trying to get in the company and you go, what's a good teammate look like to you? That's a question that not many people are asking. They're going to sit there and go, who is this person? That is,
and it changes the conversation, right?
Yeah.
And I've coached people who are applying for very senior positions. The success rate that I have is very high. And it's because they've had some of those conversations. They said, as soon as I started asking some of those benevolence questions, the whole conversation changed. It was a different interview than I've ever had before.
And that's because it's a deeper conversation than you've ever had before. And most of the time, the issue is that when people are getting interviewed, they go into this nervous state of, I have to answer all the questions. When in reality, you're interviewing the company as well, and you should probably ask a lot of questions.
Right. What does success look like here? How would I know that I'm going to get there? So you're asking questions that send a signal of, I'm not just here for a paycheck. I'm here because I want to make a difference. I want to be engaged. And I want to know if this is a good fit for me as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely, Darryl. I think that's awesome. Because I really enjoy when you dive into it, because you're first of all giving an example to everyone, which is huge. And then when you just, people can, it's real time. It makes sense. I appreciate it. The value is, it's immense. It's a huge thing, and I appreciate that. Now I know you're doing. You have a book, right?
Yeah.
What's
Building
going on with
trust, exceptional leadership in an uncertain world. I found that I was having really profound impact with people. Like I'd helped people profoundly improve their leadership skills. And there's a bunch of stories that I could tell about having really positive impacts on people. But I felt like I was dropping small grains of sand in the ocean. And what I want is for people to come alongside and pick up great big rocks with me. And so I really was trying to scale this to try to share it with the world. Because God forbid, if I get hit by a bus tomorrow, I don't want what I know to go away. And so I wrote the book. And in the book, I really tried to reveal everything I could about the model, about the 10 different levers, about how to pull them, and I gave case studies and all that kind of stuff. I've created a masterclass that people can take that walks them through how to pull some of the levers and build stronger relationships. I'm really trying to scale what I do because I see some big problems in the world, Jordan. I mean, we've got climate change, we've got race relations, we've got pandemics, we've got, technological changes in norms and values, political divides. All of these are, I think of them as big, hairy problems. Some people talk about them as wicked problems. They require collective collaborative action for us to solve. And our trust levels are at the lowest we've ever seen. And I don't see a lot of people talking about how to actually build trust. And I try to have a really practical, applied approach. And so I'm hoping that your listeners will buy the book. They can go to my website, trustunlimited.com. The courses are connected there. There's articles that they can read in the blog section for free. There's a link to the book. The book can be bought on Amazon or anywhere else. Don't just buy the book, read the book, apply the concepts, practice the skills. And you'll find that people are more than willing to give you the benefit of the doubt if you communicate clearly with them. If you say, hey, I'm reading this book, I'm trying to get better at building stronger relationships. I want to be intentional about this. Man, people will open up and be willing to help you work through it. So,
And the other thing is that you'll have deep conversations like you never had with some of the people around you, because you guys gotten so accustomed to, oh, I love that TV show. That broccoli was really good tonight. It breaks up the mundane because it allows you to have that deep conversation of, what do you really care about? And sometimes people go, I'm not sure. I haven't thought about that. Maybe we could work on it together. And
right.
having those profound, and the other element I want to include is that you never have to speak. You just have to keep asking the questions. That person will finally get the message that if they're inclusive enough, then they'll ask you what's going on. But it's
Yeah.
so important, because if you go, what do you really enjoy in life? And then Darryl will answer for a second. And then I go, well, I enjoy this as well. That can ruin a conversation. And one of the ways I like to look at it is pretend there's a flashlight, like you're on a stage.
Yeah.
And when you have a conversation, it goes from side to side from whoever's speaking. And
Right.
if you take the stage light for too long, it really can impede a conversation, the depth that you can really get to.
Yeah.
So I just want to add that little tidbit.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And part of what the model I use does is it gives people a vocabulary. Because one of the worst ways to ask people to find out if somebody trusts you is to say, do you trust me? Because there's this awkward, like, God, I can't say no now, because that's going to destroy things. That's going to make people uncomfortable. Instead, when I'm talking to leaders, I'll say, trust is a willingness to make yourself vulnerable when you can't completely predict how someone else is going to behave. So if you want to know if someone trusts you, ask yourself, how can they be vulnerable? And then are they? And, in our personal lives, it can be about actually having real conversations. And what the book does is it gives a vocabulary that we can use where we can talk about uncertainty, and we can talk about vulnerability, and we can talk about the stories that we have as we interpret the world. I've worked with folks who don't get along very well, or who have had a split in their relationship. And the first step I tend to take is connect with person one, ask them what their story is. Connect with person two, ask them what their story is, then bring them together and ask person one to tell me what they think person two's story is. And then flip it and say, person two, what do you think person one's story is? And it gives them a chance. It pushes them into a place of empathy. It gives them a chance to try to articulate, but it also gives them a chance to correct misperceptions. And it creates this dynamic where we can have a conversation that maybe we couldn't have before.
Yeah, that is so good. That is so good because it allows you to have other perspectives. Majority of the time, we're always sitting in our perspective
Yeah.
and we don't see other people. And that's where a big mistake occurs.
Yeah. And they're making assumptions about us. We're making assumptions about them, and we're not communicating, here's my story. And I want to know what your story is. Here's what I think it is. Am I right? Am I wrong? Have I missed the boat? And so clarifying.
Absolutely. And one of the coolest things is about this podcast is that I get to hear people's stories every day. And these are not, hey, Darryl, I got to sell you something right now because we're wasting our time. It's no, we're building a real connection here.
Yeah.
You can replicate this framework at your dinner table, at the conversations you have, where you just ask your parent or ask your grandparent or ask the person you're engaged to or with or whoever,
Yeah.
what is their story?
Yeah.
Because maybe you don't know that they got bullied as a little kid and that's why they're mean right now. Like, you don't know these things.
Absolutely. And because story is so powerful, I mean, I have the choice every day to tell a profoundly negative story about myself or a profoundly positive story. As a dad, I believe that my role is to have a relentlessly positive story about my kids and to help them reinterpret the world through a more positive lens. They'll come home and they'll say, this person was a jerk today. And I'll say, it probably wasn't about you. That person may have been going through something. They may have been struggling with something. We don't know what's going on for them. And so you ended up on the end of it, but it may not have had anything to do with you. And so reinterpreting that exchange and that interaction allows them to be more resilient, to be more questioning. The next time they interact with that person and they're cranky, the ability to say, you seem really upset with me. Is it me? And it allows that potential to say, yeah, I'm frustrated with the following, or, oh God, no, I'm sorry. I'm just having a hard time. I mean, when the pandemic was in full rage and there was the conflict around wearing masks or not, I'm legally blind. I have this post-concussion syndrome thing going on. I don't go out of the house a whole lot. When I do, sometimes I'd forget to take my mask. So is people's story about Darryl that he's this, anti-vaxxing guy who's passionate about not wearing masks, or is it that he's forgetful and he just messed up today? And it's probably the former, right? Unless they know me or ask me. And so there's the potential for us to be far more divided than we need to be if we don't ask people about their stories.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, the vulnerability and sharing. And the thing is that we don't realize is most people, I mean, some people live very intentional lives, but I would say most, like, you think maybe someone's not intentionally reaching out to you, they might have just forgot. Like,
Right.
sometimes I sit there and I'm like, should I follow up with that person because they said they were going to get back to me? And I'm like, maybe they're playing a game or something, or maybe
Right.
it's just not like they just forgot. And
Yeah.
that's okay. And that's okay to follow up and that's okay to check in. And
Yeah.
regarding the story about your son, I think when you view life through a positive lens, there's so much more opportunity. It makes everything a lot more potential. And if your son even just said, it doesn't even have to be, is this about me? Because then it's like bringing that back to the point. It's just, are you okay?
Yeah.
Like, is everything all right? And then the guy gonna go, dude, my mom, she's angry at me, this happened, that happened. Like, just here's a hug. Like,
Yeah.
and everyone gets, like, unless it was specifically your fault, like, and most of the time it's not. Most
Most
of
of
the
the time
time,
it isn't.
yeah, there's so much going on in life. People don't have
One of
time to.
my advisors talked to me about this experience he had. He was going to school in New York, and he went to a conference in Portland. And he arrives, and one of the folks at the conference said, "I bet you thought we'd all be wearing cowboy hats here in Portland." And he said, "I didn't have the heart to say that in New York, we just don't think about Portland." So it never occurred to me whether they'd be wearing cowboy hats or not. And a lot of times we're Portland. People aren't thinking about us. And if we go through life being New York and not thinking about Portland, um, there's a lot of chance for misunderstandings to take place. And if we can actually take that moment and ask questions and be thoughtful about the other person and say, this is the behavior I'm observing, is everything okay? I had somebody miss a call with me twice. And the second time I reached out and I said, is everything all right? I'm just checking in to make sure that, and the response was so positive. It was because I'd started with that positive narrative of, you didn't do this intentionally. You're not trying to send me a message. I'm checking in to make sure you're okay. And it's not Pollyanna. I'm not always nice. I'm not always, but I do start with a positive story, especially about my kids. And that doesn't mean I don't hold them accountable. It doesn't mean I don't give them feedback. It doesn't mean I don't, help them grow and learn and develop. But I start with a positive narrative about who they are as human beings, which means that new information that comes to me has a positive tint to it. And then I'm curious about their perception rather than jumping to judgment.
Yeah, and I would highly recommend this for anyone, whether it's the relationship you're in, because there's sometimes when you just get angry at the world and you might take that out on your spouse or a loved one, and it's like, it's not their fault either.
Right.
Not their fault either. So if you have that positive, what am I grateful for? What is a positive attribute about this person? You're going to view them in that positive light instead of sitting there going, oh my God, woe is me. How can I do this?
Yeah.
Everyone's out to get me. And then you're just going to drive away business. You're going to drive away the relationship that you want. And then you're going to be all by yourself. And it's just because you couldn't set yourself up to be in the proper perspective.
And that awareness that somebody else may have a different story, or they don't know what's going on in my head, I may actually need to include them in this conversation. And I got to tell you, my sons have such a generous assumption about me now, right? Because I mess up, I make mistakes, and I don't always handle things perfectly. And their assumption is that I've got their best interest at heart, that I'm on their side. And so they have the most positive possible interpretation of me and my actions. And I got to tell you, it's a nice way to live.
Well, it's been very intentional for the past. You've shown up time and time again, and that's really deep, deep trust in people is, hey, you called me, I'll get back to you. Or you answer the
Yeah.
phone, you tell them that you're there. And it's not available at every moment, but it's like, when I see this, I will get back to you, and you are important.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. Darryl, I don't want to end this because I feel
I
like
know.
because I don't know what nugget you're going to say next, but this has been absolutely incredible.
Well, I hope we've achieved the goal you had of leaving your listeners with some tidbits, some things that they can actually try and apply. I hope people get the sense that I'm not holding back anything, that I try to be as open and honest as I possibly can, because that's my objective, is to help people build
Yeah,
a better world.
I appreciate that. And we are going to put your website in the show notes,
Perfect.
and I'm going to get a book, and we're going to see what we can do and really impact this world. So I appreciate this, Darryl.
Thanks, buddy. It's been fantastic.